Love that. Hey, good to see everybody here today. If you're new, if I haven't met you before, my name is TJ, and I am so glad that you're here. We are in the second week of a sermon series that we are doing entitled, My Big Fat Mouth. And the reason why we're doing it is because, the reason why we're talking about all this stuff is because words are powerful. In fact, in the New Testament, there's this writer named James who describes our tongue this way. He says, the tongue is kind of like a rudder on a massive ship. It's a small part of the ship, but it has disproportionate power to steer the ship in one direction or the other. And our mouths can be like that. They steer our lives. And sometimes they steer our lives in a direction that we want to go, and sometimes they steer our life in a direction that we don't want to go. And quite frankly, our tongues have the power to steer someone else's life too. And sometimes we send that person's life in a good direction, and sometimes we send their life in a not so good direction. So we're talking about my big fat mouth. Now, last week we talked about the subject of complaining, and ultimately what we said is complaining never steers our life in a direction that we want it to go. It destroys, it tears down, it doesn't give us what we want, it robs us of blessings, and a whole host of other things. And so our conclusion last week was, instead of complaining, what we should probably do is, if we can change our circumstances, then we should do something about it. And if we can't change our circumstances, then what we need to do is we need to change our perspective. And by the way, if you missed last week, let me remind you, you can go online. You can go to crosswaychurch.com, crossway.news, or our YouTube channel, and you can catch it there. In fact, last week, we have the whole service. Oftentimes, we just post the sermon, but we have the whole service online because we baptized people last week, and man, it was an incredible day in God's house last week. So if you missed it, man, you really missed something, but you can go back and you can watch it all online. Well, today, I want to kind of shift to a different subject that's connected to our mouth, and I want to do it by telling you a story. I have a friend that goes to our church, and I think probably about 4 or 5 years ago, my friend started dating this guy, and she had just gotten out of a really bad relationship with a guy that mistreated her, a guy that was arrogant and trampled on her. And so when she met this guy, he was charming, he was kind, he was immediately likable, and she was just drawn to him. And the relationship really started well, and it started progressing, and it really just seemed like it was going to be a really good thing. And both people in the relationship started to wonder, man, well, what is this relationship going to become? Where is this thing going? And so what they did was they started introducing each other to their loved ones. And so she brought him over to their family Thanksgiving and introduced him to her family, and then he started introducing her to some of his loved ones. And he had one particular loved one that was absolutely just a beautiful woman. I mean, just model beautiful. In fact, it's almost incomprehensible how attractive this woman was. She was known for her beauty. She knew she was beautiful. Other people knew she was beautiful. And quite frankly, my friend respected this woman and her beauty and admired it too, just like everybody else. So when she met this loved one of the guy that she was dating, the woman looked over at my friend and said, "You are so ugly. I can't believe how ugly you are. I never imagined in a million years that he would end up being with somebody that's as ugly as you." And he finished off this way. She said, "You know, it's actually a weird thing, but he's physically uglier because he's dating you." Now, my friend sort of finished the conversation. Of course, she was stunned, and she finished the conversation by simply saying, "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" The woman said no, and they parted ways. Well, a couple months later, the relationship ended. And then not too long after that, my friend ended up meeting a man that truly is a good man. He's kind, he loves God, he loves her, and they got married. And today she has a great marriage with a man that loves her, that thinks that she is the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. But you know, in spite of all of that, there are still moments. There's still moments where my friend wonders, she thinks back to that conversation, and she wonders, Is it true? Am I ugly? To this very day, the words that that woman spoke to her still stick, and they still affect my friend. I tell you her story because it's very connected to what I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk for a few minutes about the subject of criticism. And when I say criticism, I'm not talking about constructive criticism. I'm not talking about those, when we have those people in our life that love us, that care about us, that want nothing more than the best for us, and they see something in our life that could be a little bit better, that might really help us if we made a change. And so they pray and they think and they wrestle and they look for the right time and they try to figure out the right way, and then they sit down and they carefully pick their words, and they do everything they can to make sure that those words are communicated with love and care. I'm not talking about that. And by the way, if you don't have one of those people in your life, you're missing something. But I'm not talking about constructive criticism. I'm talking about the nasty, mean-spirited, uninformed, nagging criticism that's so common in our world today. Now, perhaps there are some of you that as soon as I mentioned that I was going to be talking about criticism, perhaps you thought to yourself, oh man, I am so glad he's talking about that. I really hope so-and-so is here. And maybe you just looked around the room for a little bit and you found them and you thought, oh good, they're here. I hope they're listening. Or perhaps you looked around the room and you didn't find them and you went, oh, of all the Sundays for them to miss. Or maybe you're thinking about somebody that doesn't even go to our church. Maybe you're thinking about a boss or a coworker, a neighbor, a relative. And the question in the back of your mind is, okay, so when do they put this stuff online? Is it Monday? Is it Tuesday? And how do I get the link? And, all that sort of stuff. Now, look, if that's what went through your mind, I want to tell you there's a reason why we're calling it my big fat mouth and not their big fat mouth. For a moment, for the next few minutes, I'd like for you to consider the possibility that maybe you're the one who struggles with criticism and a critical spirit. Criticism is so common, but the thing about criticism is that when we are the critical people, it's so hard to see it in the mirror. It's so hard to recognize when we're the ones who are criticizing and we are the ones who are critical. I mean, we see it plain as day in other people. I mean, we know it when we see it. But it's hard to know when we're doing it. And I think the reason why it's hard for us to see in the mirror is because we just generally feel so justified doing it. We hate when other people criticize us, but when we criticize other people, we say things like, well, if they weren't so reckless, or if they weren't so young, or if they weren't so inexperienced, or if they weren't so foolish, or if they didn't just spend their money so recklessly, if they were more wise, or if they listened to more people. And we just feel so justified. So we criticize people. We criticize people about what they wear. We criticize people about their political party. We criticize people because they're Ole Miss fans, and maybe that's valid. We criticize people. We criticize people about what they post online. We criticize people about the way they spend their money. We think, man, I wouldn't criticize them if they they just went on this vacation, and I know they ain't got no money. I know they're flat broke, and this is why they're broke. And we criticize, and we criticize, and we criticize. Now, interestingly, the Bible actually has a lot to say about the subject of criticism and having a critical spirit. In Galatians chapter 5, Paul is writing to a group of Christians that are a part of a church in a city called Galatia. It's a church that he started, a church that still sees him as a spiritual mentor and a spiritual father figure. And he writes to them about the subject of criticism, but he starts in a very different place than I really would have expected. Here's how he starts it. He says, look, for the whole law can be summed up in this one commandment. So he tells his people, he says, look, here's the deal. Everything that's in the Bible, the stuff that you understand, the stuff you don't understand, the stuff that confuses you, the stuff that's crystal clear, the stuff that's easy to do, the stuff that's hard to do, the stuff that you wish wasn't there, the stuff that you're glad's there, all of it. If you were to take it all and boil it down to one singular thing, and then he quotes Jesus, and he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this is something that we're pretty familiar with, isn't it? Most of us are familiar with the command, love your neighbor as yourself. At least if you call Crossway your church family, I'm hoping that you are, because we literally spent an entire month last year talking about this one command and how we do it right. But we all are familiar with this, and we like it. It makes us feel good. The problem with just saying love your neighbor as yourself, though, is that it sounds good, it sounds clear, but sometimes it's hard to know, are we doing it right, are we doing it wrong, and are we actually doing what Jesus had in mind when he said, look, love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that Paul anticipated that. I think he knew that it seems clear on the front end, but when you start applying it, it can be a little hazy. So he leans in to explain what he means about this, what it looks like. And he actually does it from the negative perspective. He goes, look, this is what love isn't. And here's what he says. But if you are always biting and devouring one another, watch out. This is not what love does. If you're always making cutting remarks, if you're always belittling, if you're always demeaning, if you're always criticizing, if you walk around with a critical spirit, Paul says, look, watch out, because that's not what Jesus meant. Now, just in case they weren't paying attention, and I imagine if Paul were standing there kind of talking this through instead of writing it, I imagine he would have gone, all right, guys, look, I need everybody to quiet down for a second. Everybody, can you get the baby to be quiet, please? Put your cell phones away, look up, I need everybody up here, eyes on me, pay attention. And then he would wait until everybody got quiet and everybody was looking at him. And then he would lean in and say, beware of destroying one another. Beware of those critical comments. Beware of the demeaning statements. Beware of the cutting things that you say. Because when you do it, you're destroying things. So let me pause here for a second and say this. Perhaps some of you are here today, and the thing that you love the most is being destroyed by the words that are coming out of your mouth. What if the intimacy that you long for in your marriage is getting eaten alive by your critical attitude? Perhaps some of you here today, you long for a marriage that's different. When you got married, you kind of thought you were going to sign up for a soulmate, a best friend, and that you were going to walk through life, and then now things are different, and you go to bed every night, and you're not sure if the person laying next to you knows them and they know you. You go to bed as strangers, you wake up as strangers, you walk through life as strangers, and it's quite possible that the reason why that's happening is because you're destroying the very thing that you want with the words that you use, the critical statements and comments. Parents, listen, there are some of us in here that are potentially building a wall between us and our children with our critical spirit. Some of you are doing that with your friends. Some of you would like to share your faith and tell your coworker or your neighbor and your friend about Jesus and what he's done for you, but you know that you can't because you have no credibility, because you complain and you're critical. So Paul warns, he says, look, beware of destroying one another. Now in the Old Testament, there was a guy by the name of Solomon who's described as the wisest man who ever lived. Of course, he was not wiser than Jesus Christ, obviously, but he's the wisest man who ever lived. He had this unusual sense about the way that life worked, and he figured out, because he was super wise, the way that things generally turn out. And so he also wrote about this subject of criticism, and here's what he says. He says, look, some people make cutting remarks. And I think if Solomon were here today, he'd probably say, look, really most people. Some people make cutting remarks. And then he contrasts that statement, and here's what he says, but the words of the wise bring healing. Some people, most people, criticize and critique and demean and belittle. But Solomon insists that there's a small category of people that understand the way that life works and the way that life generally turns out, and they see things absolutely clearly. So they take their words and they use them differently. They use their words to bring healing, and Solomon insists those people are wise. Now, Paul, again, touched on this subject and when he wrote to a different church that he started in Ephesus. And in Ephesians, he said this about the tongue. And by the way, we're actually going to come back to this verse in a couple weeks, and we're going to unpack it in more detail. But here's what he said. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for, and don't miss this, building others up. And then he says this interesting statement, according to their needs. Not according to our needs, according to the needs of the listener, the hearer, that it may benefit those who listen. Paul insists. Solomon insists. There are two ways that you and I get to use our words. We can use critical words, and we can demean, and we can tear down, and we can discourage, or we can use words of healing that lift up and strengthen and encourage. And I think the reason why Solomon and company and all these writers in Scripture, I think the reason why they keep saying this is because we rarely understand what hangs in the balance when we use our words. In the moment that we're speaking, in the moments and the conversations that we find ourselves in, we rarely understand what hangs in the balance. Because here's the thing, you have no idea how deeply your criticism might hurt somebody's heart. Conversely, you have no idea how a singular word of encouragement might be used by God to give someone the strength to carry on. We rarely understand what hangs in the balance. As a pastor, I've kind of noticed that being on the receiving end of criticism is par for the course. I have friends of mine that are pastors, and I've been a pastor long enough to know that criticism is just part of the landscape. It's part of what you sign up for when you become a pastor. Which means that I get criticized an awful lot. And don't hear me wrong, there are people in our church, most people in our church are good-hearted people, but I've noticed that there's at least one really critical person in every church. It doesn't matter what church you go to. And they feel like it's their spiritual gift, you know. And they go, I got to leverage this thing, and they just do it. And if you cut one of them down, two more grow up in their place. So you just kind of deal with that one critical person. And so, and so criticism comes my way, you know. And normally when I get criticized, there's this internal thing that I do that helps me navigate it in a healthy way. I just tell myself, hurt people, hurt people. Hurt people, hurt people, hurt people, hurt people. And what that does is it helps me to not take the criticism personally, and it helps me to think in my head, they're doing this because they're hurt. Where or how have they been hurt, and how can I help them? But I got to be honest with you. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes there are things that criticisms they leverage towards me, that they stick, and they wound. And I wish that weren't true, but it is. About 5 months ago, there were some people in our church who were criticizing me, and I won't tell you the specifics of what they said, but the bottom line version was this: you're not a very good pastor. You're doing it wrong. You're messing it up. You might want to think about doing something else. And no matter how many times I told myself, hurt people, hurt people, hurt people, hurt people, I got hurt. And I started to think, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I am messing it up. Maybe I don't belong doing this. Maybe Crossway Church needs a different pastor. Maybe I just need to get out of the way. Now, I have a friend in our church who actually comes to this service, and he had no idea I was going to tell this story today. He may not even have any idea that he did what he did. His name's Randy, and Randy loves thinking about the Bible deeply, and every so often, Randy will come to me and he'll go, I got some questions, some Bible things I'm thinking about. Can we sit down and can we talk? And I'm always like, yeah, I'm up for that, man. And so we set up an appointment and we talk about the Bible and what does it mean and what does it say and all this sort of stuff. And so he had scheduled to meet with me, and he showed up that day, and to be honest with you, I could not hide the fact that I was hurt. he picked up on it at some point in the conversation, and he asked, and I just kind of told him. I didn't tell him who was saying it. I just said, look, this is what's been said. And I'll never forget what Randy did. Randy adopted this. He had this look on his face that he was just, you could tell he was absolutely appalled and shocked. And he said, TJ, people do that? I was like, dude, welcome to my world, bro. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, TJ, I want you to know that I have, in my lifetime, I've seen and met a lot of pastors, but you are by far the best I've ever met. And don't listen to anybody who tells you different. And it was like Randy gave me a second chance. You know, I don't know if I'd have given up or quit, but I do think that part of the reason I'm standing here today, talking to you about the danger of criticism and being critical, is because Randy breathed life into me. You see, we rarely understand what hangs in the balance. We have no idea. We have no idea how our criticism might damage somebody. We have no idea how our encouragement might be used from God to give somebody the strength to go on. I think at the center of this whole subject is a question that I think all of us should wrestle with. And the question is this: which person do I want to be? What kind of person do I want to be? Because all of us have a choice. There really are only two options here. We can choose to be a fault finder. And quite frankly, most of us are. And I'm not dogging you out, and I'm not trying to be ugly, because I find myself here way more often than I should. I'm there with you. Most of us are here, though. And we're there because we have a sinful nature, and we have this bent towards things that are not God-honoring. We have this thing about us that we walk into things and situations and places, and we just start looking for what's wrong. And it just becomes easy to do. And so when it comes to our spouse, we criticize. I don't like the way you eat. I don't like that you leave the toilet seat up. I don't like that you want it down. I don't like the way that you spend money. I don't like the way that you want to manage every penny of it. I don't like, you're driving me nuts. You breathe weird. All kinds of stuff. We come to our kids, We criticize those of us as parents. We do this with our kids too. We do it with our friends. We do it at work. We go to work. Somebody leads a meeting. We don't like the way that they led the meeting. We criticize. We come to church. You don't agree with the song that Kelly chose, or who knows, and you just don't, all right, and criticize. And this is just what we do. Now, there's the really troubling reality about it is that when you look through the Bible, that the people who are known for this, the people who did this constantly, in fact, the people who every time they show up are doing this are the Pharisees. Literally, that's kind of their MO. But that's not nearly as troubling as the fact that in Revelation, we're told that Satan himself is the accuser of brethren. In other words, literally, every day, all day, he just points out faults. God, did you see that? 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 And he does it about you and you and you and all of us. And the troubling part of that is that when you and I are critical, when you and I criticize, we may not realize it, but we're more like Satan than we realize. But in spite of that, we criticize, don't we? And there are probably a number of reasons why. Sometimes we criticize people from a place of pride. We just think that we're better than somebody else. We're better, we're smarter, we know more, we're more experienced, and we just criticize. Sometimes we criticize, and it comes from a place of insecurity. We see a weakness that we have in somebody else's life, and so in order to make us feel better about ourselves, so that we don't look as bad as maybe we would, we point out somebody else's faults. But sometimes criticism actually comes from a place of ignorance, like we just don't understand. For instance, my wife and I, before we had kids, when we, first 3 years of our marriage, we didn't have kids. And so we would walk into a restaurant or a store somewhere, and inevitably we would bump into some people who were young and married and did have kids. And the kids did what kids do. They acted a fool. You know what I mean? Little tyrants. And they yelled and they fussed, and we would watch as these parents would get embarrassed, and they would do everything they could to kind of get the situation under control. You know, you could see panic mode, like just moving up, you know, and my wife and I would stand there with this smug look on our faces. And then later on when we got in the car, then we would do what you have done too. Can you believe those kids? Those kids are hellions. And there's a reason why. Because those parents did this, and they didn't do this, and they did this, and you know what? They did this. They're at fault. And then we did this. And then we did something that you should never do. You know, when we become parents, our kids are never going to do that. And then we had kids. And our kids were little tyrants and terrorists, especially when they got us public, because they knew they had us hostage. And then they would act crazy, and we would start doing everything that we said that we would never do. The same thing those parents would do, and we were embarrassed and we're working out, like, look, if you'll just shut up, I'll buy you whatever you want. I'll buy you the Porsche, I'll buy you the pony, I don't even care. Just shut up, you little, oh. And now, when I see parents who are being held hostage by their children publicly, you know what I want to do? I want to run over and give that mom and dad a big fat hug and go, hey, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Small humans are just jerks. It's okay. This is the way they are. You're not a bad parent. You're doing just fine. Keep it up. You're not bothering anybody. And I want to lean in with one last word of encouragement and go, hey, look, I know this feels bad, and it is bad, but they're gonna get a little bit bigger and a little bit older, and they're gonna become teenagers. Then they're gonna do the same stuff. It's okay. Just kidding, guys, you're great. But it was that, when I was critical at that season of my life, it was totally born out of ignorance. I just didn't know. But you know, regardless of why we criticize, regardless of whether we criticize from a place of pride or a place of insecurity or a place of ignorance, here's what I can say with absolute certainty for me and probably for you. I have never met a critical person that I wanted to be like. And I'm guessing you haven't either. And I think the writer of Proverbs was on to that when he said this. He said, look, it's better to live in a desert than with a quarrelsome and nagging wife. Now, I don't know why the writer of Proverbs decided to pick on women, so we're going to pick on men too. Better to live in a desert, to have bamboo shoots stuck underneath our fingernails, than with a quarrelsome and nagging husband. How about that? Just for equality's sake. But we don't generally want to be like people are critical, do we? We don't want to be around them, and we don't want to be like them. But sometimes we are. You see, we all have the choice. We can be a fault finder, or we can be a hope dealer. We can look for everybody's faults and we can point them out, or we can be a hope dealer. When you read through the accounts of Jesus' life, the biographies of his life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can't help but notice that everywhere that he went, every conversation that he had, every encounter that he had, he literally dealt hope all day, every day. And the New Testament writers, the people who encouraged us, that followed Jesus closely, that understood his message the closest, that understand his purpose the most, they kept encouraging people to do the same. Look, be a hope dealer like Jesus was. In fact, Paul, in Romans chapter 15, said this, may the God of hope, in other words, guys, look, one of the defining characteristics of our God is that he offers hope to anybody and everybody. And if you don't believe me, find some Christian that God has changed their life, that they had a terrible past and God loved them anyway. I'm telling you, this is what God is. This is what God does. And so Paul says, look, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him. And then he says this interesting statement. He says, so that you may overflow with hope. May God fill you with hope to where you reach the brim, and then it flows over, and may the hope that God gives you and the hope that God provides grow and go so much that people who are around you can't help but experience the hope that can be found in Jesus Christ. Because God's a hope dealer. He builds hope in our life to where it overflows, and we naturally should be hope dealers ourselves. By the power of the Holy Spirit. And Paul, you read his writings, I'm telling you, he dealt hope over and over and over again. In Romans chapter 8, he told Christians, hey, look, here's the thing. There's hope. You don't have to live in despair because there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. He says, hey guys, look, you can go on, you can move forward because the Holy Spirit helps us in our moments of weakness. Hey guys, it's going to be okay. You can do this because listen, Jesus stands beside the ear of the Father and he intercedes for us. Guys, you can be okay. It's going to be all right. You may not understand it. It may not be easy, but we are more than conquerors. And then he went on to say, look, I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature will be able to separate us from the love of Jesus Christ. And if you keep reading through his writings, he described Jesus as the hope, the living hope, the blessed hope, over and over and over again. Read through your New Testament. He's described as the living water, the bread of life, the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus himself claimed to come and offer us abundant life. Just dealt in hope constantly. Hope dealers. Perhaps for me, one of the most interesting stories is probably one you're familiar with. It's in John chapter 8. There's this woman who's been caught in adultery by the Pharisees who, again, are fault-finding. They catch this woman in adultery, and they don't bring the guy she's committing adultery with in front of Jesus. They bring her. And how do they figure out that she was doing that? I have a feeling they were waiting for her to mess up. And they drag her down in front of Jesus when Jesus is preaching in front of a large crowd. And they insist, Jesus, she's committed adultery and we're supposed to stone her according to law. Jesus doesn't say anything. He just kneels down and starts writing in the sand. And nobody knows what Jesus wrote. Some people think that maybe Jesus wrote the 10 Commandments. Some people think that Jesus wrote the names of the people who were standing there in the crowd that wanted to stone her who had also committed adultery. We don't really know. Jesus just writes for a while, and then he goes, hey guys, I tell you what, how about the one of you who is without sin, why don't you throw the first stone? We'll just get this thing started. And one by one, they drop their stones, and they walk away. Now for a minute, I'd like to consider what's going on in that woman's mind. Up until this point, her life isn't very hopeful. She's convinced it's all bad. I won't survive. I can't go on. This is the end. Until she meets Jesus. So Jesus waits until everybody's gone. Then he looks up at her and says, hey, where are your accusers? And she's like, they took off. And then Jesus says, hey, go your way and sin no more. The life you were living won't bring you the thing that you're looking for. You can have forgiveness. You can have a new life. You can have the love you're really looking for. Here's some hope. At the center of the conversation is what kind of person do I want to be? Do I want to be a fault finder? Or do I want to be a hope dealer, like our Savior? It's worth noting, Satan was a fault finder. But the choice is ours. Do we want to use words that tear down, discourage, demean, belittle? Or do we want to use words that lift up, encourage, and strengthen? But every one of us makes that choice, whether we know it or not. Fault finder or hope dealer. And I'm hoping and praying that you will choose to be a hope dealer. And if you're choosing to be a hope dealer, let me just give you a couple quick pro tips. Start with you. We have this thing where we walk in and we like to look for other people, their issues first. But Jesus once made this really powerful statement. He said, look, before you go pulling the splinter out of somebody else's eye, pull the beam out of your own. Which I take that to be Jesus' way of saying, look, start with you. And when you finally reach sinless perfection, then start criticizing other people. But until you reach that point, until you are perfect and you have arrived, which, by the way, none of us are or ever will be, start with you. And then what I want to encourage you to do is look for the positive instead of focusing on the negative. And again, we walk into things and places and situations and we immediately go for looking for the negative. Perhaps, for instance, there's someone in your life, maybe you have a kid who's not a very tidy kid. Their room's never clean, their job, their chores at home are never done, and maybe that drives you nuts. But that very same kid is compassionate, and they're kind, and they're considerate of other people. Can I encourage you, instead of pointing out and focusing on and dwelling on the fact that they're not tidy, sit beside them someday and say, hey, I want you to know that I think you are special. You are so kind and so considerate of other people. And most people in our world are only looking out for number one, but you care about other people, and I think that sets you apart from everybody else. And I'm so glad God put you in our family. Can you imagine what that would do to the heart of a child? Perhaps you have a mom in your life, and she's not a Pinterest mom, and maybe she's a little disorganized. But she loves her kids, and she's there for her kids, and she's engaged in her kids' life, and she speaks words of life into her kids. Can I encourage you, instead of pointing out that maybe she's not as organized as you think she should be, or maybe she's not that Pinterest mom, can I encourage you to come alongside her and at some point look at her and say, hey, look, I want to tell you something. I know life's hard, and I know things are difficult, and I know you're tired, and I know you don't get enough sleep, and nobody generally appreciates what you're doing. And I think this all the time, and I should say it, but I'm just going to say it. I want you to know that I think you're a good mom. I've watched you with the kids, and I've seen the investment you make, and I've noticed the sacrifices. And man, your kids don't know it now, and maybe they won't ever know it, or maybe they won't know it until they're really, really old, and they're a mom too, or a dad too, but they are lucky to have you. They have no idea. They hit the parent lottery when they got you. Can you imagine what that would do to the soul of a bone-weary, tired mom who wrestles with feelings like she's failing all the time? We don't generally understand what's at stake, but I'm telling you, you have no idea how a single critical word will destroy somebody. And conversely, we have no idea how a single encouraging word might be used in that person's life. Maybe you have a husband who's a lot like me, and they're not very handy, and they will never win Yard of the Month. Like, they're never going to stick the Yard of the Month sign. Like, I'm like the neighbor they try to pretend like isn't there, you know? And maybe you're like, oh, that guy just, those bushes are a man. You know, so maybe he's like me. But he gets out there. He gets out there with his dad bod and his white New Balance shoes, in his outfit that's fashion-wise is 10 to 15 years past. And he gets on that mower and he handles his business. He won't win Yard of the Month, but he gets the job done. Can I tell you what would encourage his heart? The next time he does that, when he comes in, you give him your best come hither look. and leaning in when he gets close enough and go, "You've never been sexy in your whole life." I'm telling you, that'll encourage a dude. He will come alive. But listen, look for the positive instead of focusing on the negative. Life is hard enough, and it threatens to beat people down. They don't need us doing it too. Which brings me to the last suggestion I would like to suggest to you today. If you're looking to grow, get better, improve, there are a couple of groups that are going to start after this sermon series is over on January 29th. One is called Unglued. It's a study that's going to be exclusively for women. And the other one is called Watch Your Mouth. It's a group that's going to be exclusively for men. And I think these are going to be amazing studies. And if you want to grow and if you want to figure out how you can continue to be a hope dealer, I think that'd be a great place for you to go, a great step for you to take. The groups will start January 29th, and you can go to crossway.news to sign up. But let me finish my time with you one more time by asking you the question: which person do you want to be? Fault finder or hope dealer?